I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. A very good evening to you. Welcome to The Big Story. Tonight, if you are poor, you'd rather die at home. Otherwise, your death will punish the living. That is the observation of a healthcare funds mobilizer, Ndungu Nyoro. Nyoro was reacting to the shocking revelation that a woman died at Mp Shah Hospital and left a bill of 850,000 shillings after spending just 10 hours at the hospital. The woman was rushed there after she was stabbed by robbers at her home 2 weeks ago. The body of Matilda Onyango is still being held by the hospital mortuary, where it is accruing a bill of 2,000 shillings every day. This case is not the first. It is just one amongst many others that play out in thousands of homes in Kenya. That is if one is even lucky to be admitted at a private hospital without having the cash to pay for a deposit that can be in hundreds of thousands of shillings. This therefore underscores the need for universal healthcare in the country and the heavy burden it would relieve many if drawn and implemented with the best healthcare interest of the poor at heart. So on the program tonight, we will be discussing whether universal healthcare is indeed the solution to such cases. We shall be talking to Nerima Were of the Kenya Legal and Ethical Issues Network, Kellen Kenya, a former KMPDU founding chair and health advocate, Dr. Victor Nyani, and the Kenya Medical Association National Secretary, who is also the Dean of the School of Medicine at Moi University, Eldoret, Dr. Lukoy Atwoli. Dr. Lukoy will be joining us from Kakamega. Our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, is at the Mp Shah Hospital, where Matilda's body is still lying at the morgue tonight. Before we hear from them, we will also be giving you a story that has been put together by our Brian Obuya, who spoke to Matilda's relatives. We will get to that in a moment. But first, let's hear from Sophia Wanuna, who's our lead reporter just outside the Mp Shah Hospital. So, Sophia, a lot has happened since we first heard of this incident of Matilda Onyango, and we understand she's still lying in the morgue at that hospital, right where you are.
Yes, good evening, Yvonne. Indeed, Matilda's body is still here at the Mp Shah Hospital morgue right behind me. We have made numerous efforts throughout the day to have the management of this private hospital speak with us about what transpired. Remember, this story came to fore about 3 days ago when activist Boniface Mwangi tweeted a bill of 850,000 shillings that on 11th of April, Matilda, who was then a victim of stab wounds, was brought here by her family at about 10 p.m. She later died the next day in the morning, so just about 10 hours. And the treatment that she underwent, that bill that was presented to the family by the staff here at the Mp Shah Hospital, 850,000 shillings, causing a lot of outrage, a lot of people wondering how is it in just under 10 hours it's starting to pour out here. Yvonne, did that bill get to that much? So let's set some things straight. The family, and you'll be watching that story in a bit by Brian. He interviewed the brother, had indicated that they detained the body. So it's been 2 weeks of Matilda lying in the morgue here at Mp Shah. However, I spoke to the chief operating officer, that's Josephine Dean here at the Mp Shah, spoke on the phone, and she tells me they have not detained the body. The family is at liberty at any time when they're ready upon their funeral plans to collect the body. So conflicting details at that point on whether, as the family is saying, the body is being detained. The hospital maintains it is not being detained. The family is at liberty to take the body when they can. The family has expressed, of course, the financial constraints they face, surprised, of course, by this bill, and they've appealed for help, asked for a waiver as well. And what the brother talks about as well is that they had been informed that they needed to pay at least half of that bill before, according to him, they could be able to take the body from the morgue. And as you mentioned, the bill continues to increase because of the fee, 2,000 per day, that is charged here. However, remember, after this came out, Mp Shah at the time, 2 days ago it was, released a statement saying that the bill, when they come up with a bill for any patient, is not only based on the period of time that the patient is in hospital, but in this particular case, it was a team, multidisciplinary team that attended to her. She had to undergo surgery. There were stab wounds after a botched robbery. So this also a matter under investigation by the police. So they say a lot went into trying to save her life. She lost copious amounts of blood, which complicated the entire treatment process. She had to be taken to the intensive care unit, and there's a breakdown of that leaked, although that was the interim bill that was posted by Boniface Mwangi. The facility, that COO telling me earlier, they have since given the actual bill to the family. It's not too far from what we saw in that interim, but of course that is information they could not, they say, share with us because of doctor-patient confidentiality. And so a lot has been said since then. We'll be waiting to see and to hear from the family, because since we spoke to the authorities here and the staff, we've tried to reach to the family, because what we understand is that they came here earlier today. They had a meeting with the doctors here, and they're trying to figure out a pay structure, how the family will go about paying, because the question I put to the CEO is, so if they release the body and the family is unable to pay, what happens then? And they say what they're in talks right now, the family is cooperating with them, and they're hopeful that this will in fact be cleared, the bill, and they empathize with the family, saying that it is difficult when these particular cases come up. But then the entire conversation about the cost of healthcare, of course, coming out of this very unfortunate incident. So we'll be following up to see if, in fact, the family is able to collect their body and, of course, of their loved one, to go ahead with their burial plans, as they have indicated they're desirous to do as soon as possible. But the hospital maintaining they have done all that was in their power to save that life. It's unfortunate she died, but this bill and this are part of the structures, and perhaps we'll have one of our guests there who's a former union member talk to us about those structures, because they argued even the payment of the consultant doctors usually sometimes are very high up because of the few experts that exist in certain specialties and as far as the field that they specialize in. So you find them charging very exorbitant fees, as has been described largely. And so we've got an important conversation coming at a time that the CS Health was talking about a government that is keen on ensuring universal healthcare is a reality for all Kenyans, affordable healthcare at that, Yvonne.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sophia Wanuna, outside the precincts of the Mp Shah hospital, where Matilda's body has been lying for the last 2 weeks. She died, as Sophia told us, after treatment there. Just 10 hours at the hospital, accrued a bill of 850,000 shillings in just 10 hours. Sophia Wanuna, thank you for braving the light drizzle there while giving us that report. So that bill of 850,000 shillings in just 10 hours is what confounds everybody. As Sophia has said, the hospital says one thing, but let's hear from the family. KTN's Brian Obuya spoke to Matilda Onyango's relatives, and here now is his report.
The body of Matilda Onyango lies lifeless at the Mp Shah Hospital morgue in Parklands, Westlands, Nairobi. Matilda had died on the 12th of this month after a robbery with a violence attack in Kangemi. Matilda, who worked in Westlands, had left work that evening and arrived home at about 9:30 p.m. on Wednesday, 11th of this month. It follows that unknown attackers will trail her as she walked along this road in Gitoka, Kangemi. And as she went up the stairs to her house, her assailant stabbed her once on the thigh.
Alidungwa kisu mara moja kwa paja lake, na majirani ndio walisanyika wakampeleka hospitali.
Nilipata kama ameanza kutibiwa ilikuwa kitu saa 4. Kufikia asubuhi tukaambiwa ameaga.
The 32-year-old Matilda Onyango Sao was rushed to hospital by neighbors who described the attack as inhumane and her bleeding as severe. But what the family now describes as the real robbery and stab is not what happened to the mother of one on Wednesday, the 11th of April, but what emerged to be the interim bill.
Wakati aliaga dunia, tulikuwa tunajaribu ili angalau watupatie mwili, tupeleke Chiromo. na wakatuambia hatuwezi tukapeleka mwili Chiromo mpaka tulipe bill.
Tukapata ni 800,000. Sasa hapo tunashangaa mtu anatibiwa hizo masaa na hiyo bili inafika hapo. So kuna sisi hatuna uwezo wa kupata hiyo pesa.
Mp Shah Hospital popped out a bill of 858,355 shillings as interim bill, growing by 2,000 shillings a day for each day the body is preserved at the morgue, without which the hospital will not release the body of Matilda Nyango for burial. The case of Matilda Nyango should once again reignite the debate on the cost of healthcare in this country. While doctors at Mp Shah tried to save Matilda's life in just about 10 hours, her bed charges are standing at 42,600 and drugs dispensed within those hours being an inch away from 200,000 shillings. In a statement, the Mp Shah Hospital holds that emergency services are not just calculated based on the hours a patient spent in hospital. Hospitals detaining bodies plays out in many poor households. Its legality stumbles in the grey zone. Justice Philip Nyamuwaki in his ruling said, and I quote, "For it is trite law that there is no property in a dead body. It cannot be offered or held as security for payment of a debt. It cannot be auctioned if there is a default. It cannot be used to earn rental income in a cold room. In sum, there is no legal basis for detaining it, and it would be callous and sadistic to hold otherwise." Just like many other Kenyans, the cost of healthcare, which was allocated less than 2.5% in the budget, continues to trouble the family of Matilda, dead and detained. Brian Obuya, KTN News.
Indeed, this is a story that shocks and horrifies just about everybody who hears it. I can see your feedback, just a lot of shock and surprise at Wamushi. At JK_Mushi says, hold on, you just said a cut on her thigh, and that amounts to 850,000 Kenya shillings, please. Wahinya Charlie says, 10 hours, my goodness. Health is expensive, indeed it is. And that is what we're going to be discussing today. The legality of everything that's happened. How could it have come to 850,000 shillings in just 10 hours? We will seek understanding regarding that, and whether universal healthcare is indeed the silver bullet to help us not see stories like these again. My panel, once again with me, let me remind you, we've got Dr. Lukoy Atwole, who's joining us from Kakamega County. He's the Secretary General of the Kenya Medical Association. We have Dr. Victor Ngani, who is a former KMPDU official, and he was a medical director at a private hospital until just recently, so might be able to shed some more light on just how this situation could have occurred. Nerima Were, who is an advocate with Kellen Kenya, an organization dealing with patients' rights. Ladies, gentlemen, thank you, and welcome to the program. Dr. Ngani, I think the best place is to start with you. Is this at all possible? 850,000 shillings for treatment given to a patient over the course of 10 hours?
Called to give a definitive answer based on the facts that have been shared, because they're, in my opinion, they're a bit scanty. It would be important to understand what kind of surgery was done. When we speak about a multidisciplinary team, how many people are you talking about? I've seen cases where there's life at risk, and you've had to use as many as 6 or 7 doctors sitting in for 5 or 6 hours of surgery that can be very extensive. So without this kind of information, it's very difficult. But I've also had the privilege of working in ICU for 7 years of my career as a doctor, and it's most difficult when you're dealing with critical care patients, patients who are on the verge of, just on the border between life and death. And the way healthcare is structured worldwide is that in such a situation, all the resources available have to be poured, because if you don't do that, then this patient stands the risk of demise. I would give examples, of drugs such as Zygris, that a single dose costs 500,000 shillings. There are patients right now in the country today who have been in ICUs waiting for medication that is in the excess of $1 million. So it's a bit of a complicated question, but also not impossible because of the amount of investment that is required when a patient is faced with a life or death situation.
Nerima, because you're a lawyer and you deal with these issues, and even before I ask my question, I think it is important to issue that disclaimer that our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna, said at the top of this show. She said, according to Mp Shah Hospital, they are not detaining the body of Matilda Onyango, but that the family is free to come and collect the body at any time. But then, of course, that they must pay at least half of that bill that has accrued. But let's just talk about what happens when somebody goes to hospital. You're required to pay a certain amount of money, a deposit, and you see this mostly in private hospitals. Just talk to us about the sort of the legal areas that I don't know, stand out for you in this case.
So I think it's important to note that Matilda went into hospital in an emergency, which is probably why she's not required to pay a deposit, because emergency treatment is guaranteed in the Constitution and should be availed at any hospital, including private health facilities. With regard to that, it is pertinent that hospitals stabilize you and ensure that you are stable enough to be moved to another facility, be it a public health facility that can actually cater for you. Thus, the costs incurred just in stabilizing her are somewhat shocking, but as has been mentioned by the previous panelists, we're not clear what happened, what specific procedures were undertaken. However, with regards to emergency treatment, we have to look back to the case of Alex Madaga and the 18 hours he spent in the ambulance and the amount of shock and horror that we felt as a country when that occurred, and the reforms that need to be put in place in terms of emergency medical treatment that should be applicable in both private health facilities and public health facilities.
And that's important that you mention that case, because I think everybody remembers that. So, Nerima, in your view, where's the balance between a hospital that needs to, you know, the money and the funds, as Dr. Ngani has said, some of the medicines are expensive, some of the equipment. I mean, where's the balance between that and you know, saving a life? Should there never be a question of deposit? Should all hospitals, should we say, should that be in the law that just says, come in and get the treatment that you require, and then we can discuss matters of the bill thereafter?
I think, yes, a balance has to be stricken, because we have to appreciate that private health facilities are in most cases run as a business, and they do have expenditures, and they have overheads, and they have costs. However, in accordance with the Health Act 2017, health is a public good. And therefore, even with regard to private health facilities, when they do enter into the business of health, they must treat it as a public good and not just as a business. And therefore, the aim is not just to expend a service in order to recover money, but is to expend a public good. And what does that mean in that context? It's a human right. And they now have an obligation in providing that human right. There's now a horizontal obligation, which means with regard to emergency services and emergency treatment, there should never be a question on deposit.
Okay, I'd like to now hear from you, Dr. Lukoye. When you heard about this case, what first went through your mind? And speak to us as well about this very delicate issue of balance. I mean, you know, everyone has a right to life and to receive the health care that they require. But then this happens again and again.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. I think it is indeed sad that a patient who had stab wounds went to hospital, received some treatment, but it was not successful and the patient died. It is difficult for the family. It is difficult for anyone to take this as something that is acceptable. When we look at the cost side of the bill, as Dr. Ngani said, it is difficult to go into the specificities because we do not know exactly what was done for her. We do not know the costs, really, if we were to itemize them to say this is exactly what it went to pay. When it comes to the charges of the doctors, these are regulated, and there are rules that are published by the Medical Practitioners and Dentists Board, and it's available on the website indicating the range of charges that a patient should, that a doctor should charge when they provide a service to the patient.
All right, Dr. Atwoli, I'm sorry, I have to cut you off for just a minute. I think the lights just went out where you are. Let's fix that, and then we will come back to you in just a moment. Let's give you some lights, but we will come back to you. So, Dr. Ngani, I mean, what are we saying here? That In a state of emergency, surely there's not much choice as to which hospital you can be taken to. In many instances, the person and the patient themselves, aren't conscious, and it would be well-wishers. So are we saying we should only be going to public hospitals? And even when we do, wait, I think we actually have the lights back on with Dr. Atwoli. Dr. Ngani, just hold that thought. I'd like Dr. Atwoli to continue and finish his comments. Dr. Atwoli? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Yvonne. These are some of the problems we encounter when we are in the so-called resource-limited settings. But back to the point. At the end of the day, everybody has a right to health. At the end of the day, you have to ask yourself, who is the biggest responsibility holder? Who holds the greatest responsibility to actualize this right, apart from the citizens? It is the elected governments. So we cannot expect that the government will sit back and do nothing and expect that private hospitals will provide health services as a service and not as a business, and then go ahead and incur losses, and there's no mechanism in place to reimburse. What was envisaged when the Constitution established health as a right and the Health Act indicated, contextualized this, is that government must set up a fund for emergency services so that patients can go into any health facility and receive emergency services, and the provider is reimbursed in order to ensure that the provider continues to be there and to be available to provide emergency services. This has not been done. So this is one quick step that needs to be taken in order for us to hold private health facilities accountable, because then somebody will go to a private health facility, receive emergency care, and they will not be made poor because of the charges that we are seeing. The other thing is that if this mechanism is put in place, then it will become necessary for us to cost all the services. Because right now the costs, range. There's a huge range between the lowest and the highest cost, because even the government does not know how much it costs to provide a health service. So it will become necessary for us to cost all these services in order for us to be able to say that the cost in the private sector is exorbitant and the cost in the public sector is cheap.
Yeah.
Because the cost in the public sector,
sorry, we will come back.
I was saying that the costs in the public sector do not take into consideration the remuneration that the government pays the health workers. It doesn't take into consideration the electricity bills that the government pays. It just takes into consideration the consumables. But in the private sector, using various mechanisms, they attempt to cost all these items and load them on the service users. So this might explain some of the differences in the costing. Okay,
yes, and you're getting into an interesting space about who holds the ultimate responsibility for healthcare in the country. And we'll talk about, is there such a fund? Because Dr. Ngani, wouldn't the same persist if I went to Kenyatta National Hospital? Money is spent on healthcare, so are we saying tonight that we should have an emergency sort of fund or kitty that is given to private and public hospitals? Dr. Ngani, I think this one is for you. So, because this would happen and this would be a cost that would be incurred even if you went to a government institution. So how do we make sure that the very poor and those who need emergency treatment, such as Matilda did 2 weeks ago, that she would be able to get it at any facility, even at a public hospital? Dr. Ngani.
Allow me to take your question from a little far back. Number one, every single Kenyan is entitled to emergency care at whichever institution they go to. And for emergency cases that are real emergencies, then you need to go to the nearest health facility, and every facility should open its doors without requiring any form of payment before treatment. And these are for medical emergencies as defined in medicine. Now, the misfortune we have is that when your life is really at risk, then you may be better off in a private institution that has put in place the resources and has a setup to mobilize, healthcare workers and medication and equipment to give you the best chance of recovery. This is the sad reality of our country today. It's true that there will be still high expenses regardless of where you go, whether it's at Kenyatta or a county referral hospital, despite the limited resources in those areas. But the cost comparisons between private hospitals and public hospitals is significantly different. And this is because in the public there are two factors. One, economies of scale, and number two, it's public, highly regulated public sector kind of service provision. So my hope for my country is that we would appreciate that the best route towards universal healthcare, which would be the answer for someone like Matilda, would be to strengthen our public health system. The second option, which we had proposed earlier at the inception of the provision to have mandatory emergency treatment, was to set aside some funds to pay for people who require emergency treatment but can't afford it. Because whereas it's a right, it is not entirely free. And at the end of the day, someone meets that cost, whether it's the family, whether it's an insurance scheme, whether it's the private hospital, that cost will be paid by somebody at the end of the day. Now, as a country, then our social insurance schemes become critical in a system like this. And this is why we talk about universal healthcare coverage. I know NHIF, as of last year, was considering covering critical care, and I really pray they would do that, because this is one of the areas where families spend a lot of money, and there's no option there. The treatment has to be given.
And you're right, somebody does have to take up that cost. It could be the taxpayer, could be insurance, and we will get to the costings of that and why healthcare is so expensive in the country. Nerima, what are the rights of patients in emergency care in this country? So something happens to anybody, could be an accident, road accident. We see this all the time. What are the rights of these patients across private hospitals and public hospitals?
Treatment. As we saw from the Alex Madaga case, and as we should have hoped to have seen from this case with Matilda, was that the hospital which you first approach is required to stabilize you. That is, put you in a position whereby you can be transferred to a different hospital where maybe you can afford the cost, but they're required to stabilize you. So the first point is that no hospital should not be allowed to turn you away in a case where emergency treatment is required. The second thing is that a deposit should not be required of you. As was seen in the Alex Madaga case, the medical board found that requiring a deposit was unconstitutional. So they should not require a deposit when you seek emergency treatment. Thus, once they have stabilized you, also considering the fact that you may not be able to afford the further costs that may be incurred by you staying in that particular facility, then they are required to transfer you, preferably to a public health facility. Now, in Alex Madaga, the issue was in the course of traveling, he was unable to find a bed in Kenyatta. But considering this, as in our case, Matilda died, we're unable to see what could have happened further. However, did the hospital go further than stabilize her? Did they need to then stop at some point once she was stable and put her somewhere else? But given that she passed away, it's very difficult to assess at what point they went beyond what would have been legal for them to do. But her right as a patient was to be stabilized, was to be provided with treatment without being required to pay a deposit and without being required to make any payment as she approached the hospital.
All right, and again, they've said they're not holding the body. And even as we heard from Brian Obuya's story, the judge said in a previous case that a body is of no use with respect to even funds. You can't take out a loan off of it. But we've seen incidents like this happen in other cases where, health facilities hold, dead bodies while awaiting settlement of a bill. Nerima, what should happen in a case like that? I mean, surely it's a sad situation for a family that cannot lay the remains of their loved ones to rest because of a hospital bill, or a mortuary bill for that matter.
Yeah, it is a continuous concern, and it is not just sad, it's indignifying. To require a family that is grieving and is in mourning to now start scrambling for money just so that they can access their loved ones. And we have to consider our cultural context. Funerals are very important in a lot of our cultures. So holding that up is further indignifying. So what we need to consider is that, one, hospitals, yes, they have incurred costs. They need to recover the costs that they've incurred. However, they cannot do that using a dead body. Kenyatta National Hospital has a system whereby they can enter into a contract with the family and allow them to take the body and enter into a contract that is binding on the family. Then they can make payment according to how much they can afford to at any particular point in time, so maybe every month. So this might not be possible for private hospitals. However, they do not have any legal right to hold a body or hold anybody's funeral at bay or hold a family hostage because they're unable to pay a bill. What they have to consider is creative solutions towards a payment. So either you enter into a contract with the family, or you enter into a settlement scheme whereby they can make monthly payments, or anything that might be creative enough so that you allow the family to go through the process of grieving in dignity, as opposed to holding them hostage and furthering and exacerbating the pain they're going through.
Indeed, so you're saying we can be creative with certain ways and options to settle the bill. We want to take a short break right here on the show. When we come back, we'll start to discuss some solutions, some of which Dr. Lukoya Twali has already gone into. But the question we will be asking when we return is universal healthcare then perhaps the solution to an incident like this? We'll have that answer from my guest tonight when we return.